Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and belated Happy New Year. Welcome to the first Signature Lecture event of 2013 at the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. I'd like to thank CIGI's public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support in making this series a success. Besides the audience here tonight, we also have a global audience watching on the live webcast. And following this evening's address, we welcome questions from the audience at the microphones on either side of the auditorium. If you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to our guests here on stage through this screen. This evening, we take an unconventional and innovative look at international relations. Joining us as our keynote speaker is Dr. Rafe Sagarin, who will discuss nature's lessons for good global governance. Learning from the Octopus. Rafe is a marine ecologist and environmental policy analyst based at the University of Arizona. He studied responses of marine communities and wetlands to climate change. And he's also studied illegal fishing, pollution, and other human impacts. Sagarin uses unusual data sets from writers, naturalists, artists, and even gamblers to reassemble historical patterns of ecosystem change. Rafe was recently honored with a Guggenheim Fellowship in support of 2 books he's writing on the science of ecology and on his national security work. He served as a Geological Society of America Congressional Science Fellow, and he's taught ecology and environmental policy at leading American colleges, and his research has appeared in Science, Nature, Conservation Biology, Foreign Policy, and other leading journals, magazines, and newspapers, so he clearly has long tentacles. Please now welcome Rafe Sagarin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be up here with this great institution. So excited that, don't hate me, I left 70-degree Fahrenheit weather in Tucson to come up here. But it's really a great honor to be part of this lecture series and to be able to share with you some of the ideas that I've gathered from nature that may be relevant not just to global governance, but a number of things that we deal with in society. And you'll see that the examples I give in my talk tonight come from all over, from teaching, from global issues, from warfare to business. They all have a linkage to how nature works. And I just want to note, I put up my email here. I come out with a lot of ideas that may seem originally to come out of left field, but I find that audiences a day later, a week later, sometimes a year later, say, you know, I was thinking about that thing you said, and it just occurred to me how it relates to something in my life, and I really wanted to share it with you. So I'm not a recluse. Please contact me by email if you have some ideas, and we'll start up a conversation. The basic question that I'm getting at is, what can we learn from nature about how to be adaptable? And I'll really stress through this talk how important this concept of adaptability is. Now, the idea that a marine biologist is up here talking about international relations or talking about emergency response or terrorism wouldn't be strange to biologists in the early days of the science of ecology. Biologists like my hero, Edward Ricketts. Ricketts was a marine biologist in the early 20th century in Monterey, California. If you're at all fans of John Steinbeck's work, he appears as a fictional character in many of Steinbeck's novels. He was very influential on Steinbeck, on Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, on other artists and writers of the time. And one of the things that he and colleagues of his and his mentors felt was that there was no separation between what went on in the biological world and what happened in society. And there was even an advantage, as he says, of looking to the biological world because they are what they are. Animal communities are what they are. They cannot complicate the picture, he said, with worded idealisms, saying one thing and being another. And certainly if we think about global politics, so much of it is covered in this crust of worded idealisms. And so the idea is if you can look at the relationships of organisms, you can get beneath that and see what making and maintaining relationships in nature is really all about. Now that kind of approach to science really fell out of favor later in the 20th century, especially with the rise of molecular biology and the idea that we could understand all of biology by its smallest parts by getting down to that reductionist approach. But we're realizing in a changing world, when the climate is changing, when so many new things are happening in global geopolitics, that we can't take that reductionist approach where you go down to the smallest pieces and try to build it back up, because it looks completely different. And so there's starting to be a return back to these ideas. And my own journey of becoming a biologist who was perfectly happy to be working in these beautiful tide pools in Monterey Bay, actually right down the road from where Ed Ricketts had his laboratory, to becoming a biologist who talks about national security and who talks about terrorism and emergency response, is really a story of adaptation itself. And the first thing I say about adaptation is about leaving or being forced from your comfort zone. So if you think of these earliest amphibians coming out of these prehistoric seas, they were both forced out of that comfort zone because all of a sudden there were all these new, terrible, horrible predators there, but there was also an opportunity on land to establish a new way of living and really come to dominate those niches or ways of living that were there. And so my comfort zone had always been poking around and counting snails and measuring things in those tide pools. I was perfectly happy there, but on the day of 9/11, I was down in those tide pools with my infant daughter and feeling so far removed from what was going on the East Coast of the United States, where I had very close family in the State Department, on Capitol Hill, and I found myself yet less than a year later very far outside of my comfort zone, serving as a science advisor to then Congresswoman Hilda Solis, who was just starting her career in Congress. And Miss Solis, who's now the Labor Secretary in the United States, her major issues of interest were labor issues and environmental issues. And I thought, okay, I'm going to come into this office and help her out a lot with the environmental issues, which I'm really interested in and have a background in. But in that particular Congress, both labor issues and environmental issues were going absolutely nowhere. And so I actually found myself in this year with, oddly, a lot of time on my hands to look at other kinds of projects. And so what I basically did is I resorted to my core set of skills, which are the skills of a naturalist, someone who observes what's going on in the world and looks at the relationships of those things in the world. Of course, there are no tide pools in Washington, D.C. I guess there's a tidal basin, but it's not like the tide pools of California by any means. And so what I had to look at was just the ecology of what was going on in D.C. And at that time, less than a year after 9/11, what was going on was what I call an ecology of fear. Everywhere you went in D.C., you got this impression of this fear that was everywhere. And you would see it in the morning. All of a sudden, these Jersey barriers would emerge like mushrooms in a ring around every new monument they hadn't protected yet, and new metal detectors would pop up everywhere. And yet, it didn't take long for me to see that this ecology was nothing like the ecology of those tide pools in Monterey that I was so used to. And the difference was, every day when I go out to the tide pools in Monterey, there's something different going on. There's some change. There's some movement. It's constantly changing. And yet, with all these security measures, as I watched them through the year, they appeared and then they stayed exactly the same. And the aha moment for me came one morning when I was walking into the House office building, and I was fumbling to get my keys out of my pocket so I could put them on the belt in the metal detector. And a young staffer turned to me and said, "Oh, don't bother taking your keys out of your pocket. Just put your hand over your keys in your pocket and you can walk right through the metal detector." And I thought, oh my God, if a Capitol Hill staffer to save 30 seconds every morning has already adapted to these new security measures, what could a terrorist do who has much more motivation to get through these systems? And so I started to think about this idea of adaptability, and I realized, and this is one of the things I love about being a biologist, is that no matter how intensely you study a biological system or how much of an expert you become on, say, the invertebrates of the California tide pools, you know about that much of all of biology. There's always more to learn. So I knew, as a biologist, I knew hardly anything about adaptability. And if I knew almost nothing about my own field of biology, relatively speaking, I knew even less about security. And so I realized if I really wanted to understand the relationship between keeping ourselves secure and biological adaptability, or just the concept of adaptability, I needed to bring in a lot of other minds. And so I designed these working groups at an ecological think tank called NCES, which is in Santa Barbara, California. And I brought together the most creative minds in biology that I could find in every field, from behavioral ecology to anthropology to psychology. And I also brought together the most willing and able and interested minds in the security realm. And these were former spies and people interested in cybersecurity and people interested in international relations. And I brought them all together for these discussions where we asked that question that I put up at the beginning of this lecture: what can we learn from nature about how to be adaptable? And these were fabulous discussions, and we, to my surprise, came up with a few general rules that come out. Despite all the different biological systems we looked at and different ways of looking at them, we kept coming around to the same ideas. And so these are the ideas that are going to drive what I talk about tonight, which is really how we become adaptable. And the real linkage to everything else we're talking about between nature and international relations, or nature and business, or nature and teaching, is that nature faces the same problem that we all face, which is that risk is everywhere in our world, and it's almost completely unpredictable. The difference is that biological organisms have been dealing with this problem successfully for 3.5 billion years. It's an unbelievably large, almost infinite database about how to solve this problem of risk in your environment that's very unpredictable. And so a few general laws come out from this. The first thing is, I say the world is full of unpredictable risk, but a fish doesn't try to turn a shark into a vegetarian. So what I mean by that is the fish will do anything in its power to escape from that shark. It may even try to form a partnership with that shark. Anything it can do to keep from getting eaten by that shark, but it has no notion in its little fish brain that it is going to get rid of predation in its world. It knows that if it escapes this shark, predation is still going to be there. And yet so many things we try to do, we try to make absolute solutions that get rid of the risk, and it's a complete waste of our time and our energy. And we saw that a lot after 9/11, the war on terrorism, the war on drugs. In my own field of ecology, we have a war on invasive species. This kind of language implicates that it's something that we can eliminate, when in fact there are underlying risks that will always be there, and we need to learn how to adapt and live with these risks. And living with risk sounds a little passive, but really I hope to show you that it's a very dynamic thing that organisms in nature, again, have been doing for billions of years, and there's a lot of interesting strategies in how you do that. First, a few general ground rules, which are counter to a lot of the ways we think about complex problems in our world. Natural organisms do not plan, they do not predict, and they don't try to be perfect. This runs completely counter to a lot of things we do. We have all kinds of planning exercises. We have predictive models. We try to figure out what's going to happen in the future, and we're always trying to optimize or be perfect or give 110%. Nature doesn't care about that. So as an example of the first thing, I have a little exercise where I ask you all to imagine you're sitting on a drafting table and someone's asked you to plan a fish for them. Someone said, "You're going to be the creator, plan a fish for me." None of you, I guarantee, would come up with a fish that looks like this. This is the mola mola, or ocean sunfish. It's the weirdest, most bizarre looking fish. No one would plan to make a fish that looks like this, but this fish is incredibly successful. It's the largest bony fish. It's been around for millions of years. It has learned how to solve a problem and fill a niche or a way of living that no other organism did, and it did it well enough to survive. And even when you see these things live, as I've had the chance to do one time scuba diving, you still don't believe it's a real organism. Secondly, organisms in nature don't predict the future in any kind of long-term way. They are incredibly observational, and so they can get a sense about what is likely to happen or changes that are going to happen. So we looked at animals after the big Boxing Day tsunami and looked back and saw that they were acting strangely all morning, well before any humans had a notion there was a big tsunami wave. And some people wrote they predicted the tsunami. They didn't predict it. They used their incredibly keen observational senses to look for patterns and changes in those patterns, but they weren't predicting the future. And then this idea of perfection is overwrought. First of all, it's not survival of the fittest that matters. All you have to do is survive so you can reproduce yourself. So it's survival of the good enough to reproduce themselves. That's it. You don't have to be the fittest. You hear on the Discovery Channel, the great white shark, nature's perfect predator. And I always laugh and say, well, the great white shark would be so much better if it had laser beam eyes or something like that. There's no way to measure perfection in nature. You just have to be good enough to solve those problems before you. And so this idea of solving problems, living with risk, being adaptable, that sounds well and good. And lots of people and organizations are saying, we've got to be more adaptable these days. And there's sort of a notion, okay, adaptability is about changing and responding to things more quickly and not being all bureaucratic, but it gets kind of muddled after that. And so what I hope to do is break down natural adaptability into simple concepts that we can then apply in a safe way to what we do in society. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. Just 4 or 5 concepts that are common in adaptable systems that we can use. And the first idea, and probably the most important, comes from this amazing member of my working group named Gary Vermeij. Vermeij is a paleobiologist. He studies fossil life, and he's one of the most amazing naturalists anyone has ever met. He can identify all these different fossils from all different eras and all different kinds of species. And it's especially remarkable to most of us because Vermeij has been blind since he was 3 years old. So everything he does is through his sense of touch, and he can touch a fossilized snail and tell you how it lived and how it died and where it belongs in the proliferation of life. And he doesn't just catalog and list species that he identifies, but he looks at patterns in the history of life. And one of the patterns he looks at is what species have been most successful, have diversified the most. What are the characteristics of them? And he finds that the species that are really adaptable are those that have a decentralized way of sensing and responding to changes in their environment. And some examples will help clarify this idea. The octopus is a great example. The octopus, surprisingly, has a wonderful mind. It has a cognitive mind like we do. Its mind is not that similar to us in terms of problem solving and that kind of thing. But it doesn't use this wonderful central brain of its to tell each arm what color to change when it needs to camouflage itself. It doesn't say arm 1 turn red, and arm 2 you've got to turn kind of fuchsia, and arm 3 turn kind of spotted purple and red. That would take too long and it wouldn't get the job done. In fact, what happens is individual skin cells spread out all across the octopus's body individually are sensing the change in their environment and changing to respond to it, and that collectively gives the octopus its camouflage. A little closer to home, that's like our immune system. Our immune system has a bunch of cells running around our body looking for invading pathogens and responding to those pathogens without any conference calls up to our awesome brain saying, what should I do now? I think there's a pathogen coming here. Should I do something? What should I do? It just has those individual cells finding the problem, solving the problem, and then collectively giving our body its immunity. We tend when we are under threat in society to do the opposite. In the United States, one of our biggest responses after 9/11 was creating this, the Department of Homeland Security. This is the opposite solution. This is a highly centralized, top-down bureaucracy, and its very first test after 9/11 was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And the big question after Hurricane Katrina, when emergency response wasn't coming, where services weren't coming, was where's FEMA? That's our Federal Emergency Management Agency. Well, if you want to find an agency in a government bureaucracy, you've got to go back to the org chart. There it is. There's FEMA. It's one of these boxes stacked up within this bureau. These boxes are things like the U.S. Coast Guard is one of these boxes. All these huge boxes stacked up in other boxes, and no wonder it took so long to get information and supplies and anything up and down this chain of command. That top box is the President of the United States. That is not decentralized problem solving. Now, I'm going to move on to a second idea, but I'll return to the decentralization idea. And the second major way that adaptable systems work is that they use redundancy to solve many types of problems, because you can't predict what the exact problem will be. We think of redundancy as wasteful, as inefficient, but nature uses it all the time. And if something was wasteful in nature, it would have been selected away by now, but it's everywhere in nature, at every level, from our DNA to individuals, to communities of individuals, to ecosystems. And again, Gary Vermeer gives us some insight about redundancy. He says there's simple redundancy in nature, like this centipede, which has multiple copies of walking legs, and that's all well and good. Centipedes have done fine in evolutionary time, but they haven't been nearly as successful as their cousins, the Beatles. The Beatles are so successful and have taken over so many niches all over the world and proliferated and diversified so much that the biologist J.B.S. Haldane was once asked, "What do all your studies of nature tell you about the Creator?" And he said, well, he must have an inordinate fondness for beetles. So beetles are everywhere, and what they've done is they've taken that simple redundancy and just modified parts of it a little bit. So now those walking legs become wings and armor and devices for shooting chemical weapons and all kinds of different contraptions that are all working on a slightly different version of whatever problem might come up. And this combination of the decentralized sensing the world and the redundancy gives you multiple ways of seeing a problem and multiple ways of responding to a problem. And there are some great examples. I started on a bad note with humans, but there are some fabulous examples of how decentralized and redundant solutions work, how cheap they are, how effective they are. They can be spontaneous or they can be institutionalized. And this, so it's not just adaptability just happens spontaneously. Sometimes it does. On the day of 9/11, there were thousands of people trapped in Lower Manhattan. And there were a bunch of people in New York and New Jersey and other places who realized, wait a second, I've got a boat. I'm seeing on TV all these people stuck in Lower Manhattan. They can't get anywhere. I'm going to take my boat down to Lower Manhattan, and I'm going to get those people out, and I'm going to call my buddy who has a boat. And you had this spontaneous boat lift by individuals, the Coast Guard joining in. They see what's going on. They realize we've got to get out of the way. We're going to down-regulate everything, let these guys come in and take as many people as they can on those boats, as many people as is safe on those boats. And you had one of the largest, if not the largest, mass evacuations of people, and it all happened spontaneous by individuals who were in the right place, seeing the problem, and had a way to respond to that problem. Now, on the institutional side, Google is an institution that is built with decentralization in mind. One of the things they do is they require every one of their project managers to spend 20% of their time doing something completely different from what they were hired for. It's called 20% project. That activates some of this independent thinking. And one of those 20% projects became what's called Google Flu Trends. Google Flu Trends now uses all of us as those independent sensors of change, because when we start searching, what are flu symptoms? What are flu remedies? My child's doing this. Does she have flu? Google is compiling those searches. And those searches from all of us individually gives Google a trace of when flu is actually prevalent that turns out to match exactly to the same kind of trace of flu outbreaks that you can get from, say, the Centers for Disease Control, which sends out surveys to doctors and hospitals, gets them back to Atlanta, compiles them, does statistics on them, publishes them, and gives you a sense of the flu outbreak that year. The only difference is that Google Flu Trends can give you the same data 2 weeks before the CDC can give you the data. That shows you how powerful and fast decentralized approaches can be. Now, animals especially, all organisms communicate to some extent, but animals especially communicate to mitigate, to reduce the risk that there is always in their environment. And they communicate sometimes in very obvious ways, like this coral snake, which shows through its coloration, I'm poisonous, stay away from me. And they communicate in more subtle ways, and often they communicate in the language of their adversaries. So this ground squirrel, and this is a study that was only done a few years ago. You wouldn't think there's anything interesting about a ground squirrel. But ground squirrels, like many prey species, communicate to their predators. Because what it does is when they make a call to a predator, they say, I know you're there, you can't sneak up on me. And predation is costly. It takes a lot of energy. So you're not going to waste your time on a ground squirrel that knows you're there. Now, what the ground squirrel does, if it's a hawk or a coyote, say, the ground squirrel makes a loud call, a shrill call, and it says, I know you're there. You can't sneak up on me, so don't waste your time. And it usually works. They don't make a loud call when a snake is nearby. Snakes don't hear. A loud call wouldn't do anything. What they do is they lift up their tail and they puff it up in a kind of menacing way, and the snake's like, wow, that ground squirrel looks bigger than I thought it was. I think I'm going to back off. But if, and only if, that snake is a rattlesnake, the ground squirrel heats up its tail because rattlesnakes see in infrared. So this animal is communicating in the language of its individual predators. And it's a lesson we would be well to learn. One example where we did this really poorly is right after we killed Osama bin Laden, the CIA released videotapes that were taken from his house, and all the papers and all the online and television media had similar responses to these videos. Bin Laden's home videos show vain, frail recluse. Videos demystify the Osama bin Laden legend. They talked about how Osama was living in these squalid conditions. He looked raggedy and he was bobbing up and down in this weird way. This message was seen completely differently by our adversaries, by radical Muslims who saw a man who wasn't hiding but kept his beard, like the Prophet would have done. A man who was rich, who still lived in poverty, like the Prophet would have done, and was still praying all the time. And so the message we thought we were sowing, look at this pathetic guy who you were all following, turns out to be a message that emboldened his followers because we weren't speaking in a language that our adversaries were understanding. Now, you can do all of this kind of stuff. You can have a decentralized way of sensing the world. You can have all kinds of redundant doodads to respond to whatever comes up. You can communicate effectively, but every organism on Earth will run into the limits of its adaptability. And when it does, it has to reach out to another organism and form a symbiotic partnership. Every single organism on Earth has multiple symbiotic partnerships with other organisms. They can be fleeting partnerships or partnerships that last so long that the species become inseparable. What's interesting about these partnerships is that they often occur between species you would think would have nothing to do with one another, like this little cleaner wrasse fish that goes right into the mouth of this big predatory fish and cleans out its parasites. And they have a good partnership. Another thing interesting about symbiosis, it creates what we call emergent properties, things that you wouldn't expect by just adding one and one together. So we know now that this large predatory fish becomes much less aggressive to all the fish on that reef patch when that little fish has set up this cleaning station. That's an emergent property that we wouldn't expect just from the relationship of the two of them. And throughout evolutionary history, we've seen that most symbiotic partnerships emerge out of relationships that used to be conflictual, used to be agonistic. So there's this continual cycle of species being in conflict, finding out that they do better through a symbiotic partnership, and then that partnership coming into conflict with another group of partners, and those eventually becoming symbiotic together. So it's a continual cycling of conflict and cooperation, where cooperation is actually the function that wins out. We tend to do the opposite, again, when we're faced with a problem. We put up a wall against our adversaries. This is close to home for me. This is the border wall with Mexico, just a few miles from my house in Tucson. But I will suggest through examples that symbiotic partnerships between human groups can be used to break these walls. And this is my colleague in the upper corner who joined me from the earliest days of these working groups, Terry Taylor. He runs the International Council for Life Sciences in Washington, D.C. I like to joke around and say if you look at Terry's resume, you're basically looking at James Bond's resume. Until he retired from Secret Service in Britain and then got into chemical and biological weapons proliferation and trying to avoid that. And through that, realizing that he couldn't just look at chemical or biological weapons, but had to look at the full spectrum of public health systems and that sort of thing to understand how are we going to deal with the threat of biological and chemical weapons. It's not enough just to look at the militarized form of biological things that can happen to you. And so through that, he got into developing partnerships, and in this case, this is a partnership between Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian doctors and health practitioners who are all working together to deal with the problem of infectious disease, no matter what side of whatever disputed territories these diseases arise upon, because these doctors know the disease is going to kill you first. It doesn't matter what the politics are. And that's a very important construct of symbiotic relationships. They're intently focused on the problem at hand, rather than whether it's a good political idea or not for Israelis and Palestinians and Jordanians to be working together. They know they've got to solve the problem. The other thing, remember I said natural organisms don't aim for perfection. These guys are not in this to create peace in the Middle East. That is not one of their goals. They're again intently focused on the problem at hand, which is infectious disease. And that becomes an important core, which may ultimately lead to more peaceful relationships. But right now, they're just focused on that problem. And these relationships have been so successful that Terry Taylor has helped to facilitate similar partnerships in 6 countries around the Mekong River, which are no less friendly towards one another, and now in countries in southern Africa. And that leads to one last aspect of adaptable systems is that adaptable systems learn from success and they replicate that success. We hear a lot these days, especially in the business and organizational kind of gurus, about learning from failure and how good it is to learn from failure. And that sounds good. It sounds like we're owning up to it and we failed, but we're going to learn from it and move on. Well, learning from failure is an evolutionary dead end. In nature, it means you died and you didn't reproduce yourself. Done. That's it. The failure ends there. The only process that works in nature is learning from success, building off those successes, making even better organisms from past successes. Every living thing on Earth right now is an example of learning from the successes of its ancestors. It's a positive feedback process that brings more success. And yet, almost all organizations that we create focus intently on failure. And I'll go back to the Hurricane Katrina response. Here, there were a lot of failures. And I don't want to dismiss the importance of owning up to failures, to not repeating the same stupid mistakes again. You want to know what they were and make sure you don't do them again. This is the Townsend After Action report. And it's about all the things that we did after Hurricane Katrina. It's almost entirely focused on failure. There's over 110 different failures identified and what we should do about them in the future. There's almost nothing about the successes, and there were successes in the response to Hurricane Katrina. There's nothing about what went right. One of the things that went very right after Katrina is the Coast Guard and partners helped to contain and clean up a 9 million gallon oil spill. You won't read a word about it in the Townsend After Action report, but yet, when would it be important to know about cleaning up oil in the Gulf of Mexico under really difficult, oh right, the very next Gulf of Mexico disaster, which was Deepwater Horizon, that oil rig that went up in flames. There was a major oil spill, and the one lesson from the last disaster in the Gulf that you'd want to learn from is the lesson about cleaning up oil. But that wasn't well documented. So the point about all these ideas about adaptability is you can use them as a spotlight to look at, as I've done mostly so far, look at organizations and companies and are they being adaptable or not being adaptable, or we can use it as a map about how to go forward. And I'll just briefly show an example of how in the book Learning from the Octopus I use adaptability as a spotlight. This is the really tragic case of deaths due to improvised explosive devices in Iraq, which is shown in red. These are deaths of US soldiers per month from improvised explosive devices in Iraq in red and Afghanistan in green. And every aspect of adaptable thinking or not adaptable thinking is on display in this kind of tragic scenario where we went in, and by we I'm talking about primarily the US Department of Defense leading an invasion of Iraq based on ideas, based on plans and predictions about what warfare would be like there. Very quickly, on the ground there, those individual, independent sensors, which are the grunt soldiers and young officers who are down on the ground there, see that this war is not at all like the war that the Pentagon had planned for. And in fact, improvised explosive devices were going to be the biggest threat to their security, not the Republican Guard, not a standing army. And so this issue became so strong that not long into the war, when then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld came to do a press conference in Kuwait, a young specialist, Thomas Wilson from the Tennessee National Guard, had the audacity to get up and dress down the Secretary of Defense and say, hey, we are out there with hillbilly armor. We're strapping on scrap metal to our Humvees because we're all getting killed by these IEDs. What are you going to do about it? And Rumsfeld quickly responded, well, you go to war with the army you have, soldier, which is about the most unadaptable statement I've heard. But nonetheless, Congress got into the debate. This was widely televised, this little altercation. And they said, we got to get more armor to our troops. What are we doing out there? So this centralized military industrial machine that we have, the Pentagon and all its contractors got together and said, all right, we're going to design a vehicle that can withstand these blasts. And these vehicles, called MRAPs, mine-resistant vehicles, 20-ton vehicles, they don't get out into Iraq until 3 years after this altercation, by which time over 1,300 additional soldiers had died. And if you look at when they come into the theater on that red curve, it's actually well after a precipitous decline in IED deaths. They're too late for the IED story. And what actually happened was soldiers on the ground started making symbiotic partnerships with the people that used to be shooting at them, with the people that used to be bombing them. Again, symbiosis happens between unlikely partners. These guys found out they were going to do much better giving intel to small American units and tell them where the bombs were and who the bomb makers were than fighting them. And that's what led to that decline. Now, we've got these massive vehicles, and the war in Afghanistan is heating up again. We send them over there without an idea about what the environment's like there. There's no roads that can handle a 20-ton vehicle in Afghanistan, and we're limited to very predictable routes where these vehicles can go. Taliban are running around on Toyota pickup trucks, a 1-ton vehicle that's probably the most adaptable vehicle ever made. They can go where they want to. We're stuck in predictable routes, and unfortunately, the Taliban are learning from their successes, and the IED deaths go up in Afghanistan. So the question is, we don't want to look back and keep saying, well, this is how we weren't adaptable. We want to say, how can we start becoming adaptable again? And I say this because we are, like the Beatles, one of the most adaptable species on Earth. We're incredible. You guys live up here in this cold, for example. I'm not sure if I can adapt to it, but we're incredibly adaptable. When you see humans under a force of selection, like we were for most of our evolution on Earth, or like the young officers that I talk to who have fought in Afghanistan and Iraq for 10 years, you see people who are incredibly adaptable. And some of the most important lessons I've learned have been from these people who have been forced to adapt. But many of us, thankfully, are insulated from that constant force of selection that causes most organisms on Earth to adapt. So how can we sort of jumpstart that process without harming ourselves, without putting ourselves under fire all the time? And it's a very simple step we can take. We have to switch from giving orders to issuing challenges. Giving orders is when a small group of experts or a leader says, here's what's best for all of us, go do it. Issuing a challenge, by contrast, is when a leader or that small leadership organization says, we are all facing a problem here. Who among you can help us solve this problem? And when you issue a challenge, you start to initiate an adaptable system. I'll give one example of an early challenge. In the early 1700s, the biggest problem for global shipping was no one knew what their longitude was. They could calculate their latitude at sea, but not their longitude. And a lot of ships and treasure and lives went to the bottom of the sea because sailors didn't know exactly where they were. Now, people thought the great astronomers at the time would come up with some way of navigating based on celestial bodies that would get us our longitude. But British Parliament did a smart thing. They issued a challenge, and they said, anyone who can solve this problem, we're going to give you a big prize. And it turned out not to be an astronomer, but a watchmaker who figured out a way to make an accurate chronometer at sea that solved the longitude problem. So it, again, came completely out of left field. This is typical of challenge-based problem solving. It sets off all the aspects, major aspects of adaptable systems I talked about. When you issue the challenge, you get all these independent sensors interested in solving the problem, and they all have different perspectives. That gives you that creative redundancy, different ways of solving a problem, rather than just the way that the central organization or the leader would do it. And when people come together, they realize, I can solve part of this problem, but I'm really going to need to form a partnership with someone else who understands this other part of the problem, and together we could solve this problem. So you create symbiotic partnerships built around a problem. And if you're a good leader, you'll recognize how to reward the successful respondents to the challenge, and that creates the feedback, the learning from success, that makes sure that you don't just adapt one time to a new problem, but you're continually adapting to whatever new problems come up. And examples of challenge-based problem solving are exploding all over the place now. There are examples in security. DARPA, which is an agency within our Department of Defense. So it's within a big top-down plundering bureaucracy. But this little agency issues challenges. And they typically issue challenges to university engineering departments. Make us a vehicle that can navigate an autonomous course. And it's incredible how quickly and how cheaply the prize to solve these challenges is $1 million. That's what I call couch change to our Department of Defense. And they get incredibly good responses. Businesses do this. 3M, which is not at all a business like Google. It's not a high-flying .com, do what you want business. It's a blue-chip company. But when they wanted to reduce their environmental footprint, they didn't have the CEO send a memo to every employee saying, recycle 20% more, do it now. They issued a challenge. They said, anyone in this organization, tell us how we can reduce our environmental footprint. So you had administrative assistants saying, oh, we could reduce our paper waste by a whole bunch. And you had chemists in another part of the organization saying, oh, we could reduce chemical waste by X amount if we just did this. They had over 8,000 different implemented responses to this challenge. And all people in the organization got for a successful entry was like a certificate of achievement. If people believe in the mission of your organization, they will jump at the chance of solving a common challenge. And we see it again and again and again. And finally, just to turn the spotlight on myself, I'd been giving talks of this nature for several years where, as you saw, I mock the Department of Homeland Security and its org chart. And then I started looking at my classes at the university, and I realized I organize my classes just like the Department of Homeland Security. Because this is a typical class I would teach. I'm that red dot, the professor. And the classroom is the green triangle, and all my students are lined up, expected to be identical, expected to get the same information. So I would choose what we're going to read for the next seminar, a couple different papers, and I'd say, read it, and we'll discuss it. And I always wondered why, I had a couple chatty Cathys who would always talk, and then a lot of other students, even though I'm a dynamic lecturer and I'm really into the stuff I teach about, be, texting under the desk and that kind of thing. And I couldn't get it until I said, wait a second, I'm expecting them to learn in this top-down manner, which is completely counter to the way I've been talking for the last several years about adaptability. And where the sticking point came in, I realized, was in the sacred document of all organizations, which is either at the university, it's called the Syllabus. In most of your organizations, it's called an agenda. Whatever it is, it's the document that says, this is what we're going to talk about for the next hour or the next semester. And I'm required by my dean to have a syllabus when I get a course approved. I have to write out the syllabus every day, what we're going to talk about. Now what I do when I go into my classes is I say, everyone take out the syllabus that I had to give you. And I say, rip it up. So we all rip up the syllabus. And in that very first class period, I ask them some simple questions. What are you here to learn about in this class? You signed up for a class on marine environmental policy, but what do you really want to learn about within that topic? Let's list those out. And what could you teach your fellow students about this topic? Or what would you be willing to teach your fellow students about this topic? And that's how we create the entire plan for the course. And you may ask, well, why do you have a syllabus to begin with? This is like what a virus does when it enters a body. It covers itself in some kind of protein cloak, so it can get into the body, and then it starts proliferating. I have to have a syllabus because my dean requires me to have a syllabus, and I don't want him to know that I'm doing something completely different until I can show it's successful. This is what these officers in Iraq and Afghanistan did. They did things without going up the chain of command, and when they worked, they told their fellow officers. They learned from success, and by the time the higher-ups heard about it, it was successful. So I've been documenting these courses, and I'll show you how they work. And now I have a built-in measure of success. So when my dean finally learns that I've been ripping up the syllabus, and he'll learn soon because I've been talking about this stuff publicly for a while now, I can say, yeah, I do that, but look, it's really successful because this is what my courses look like now. It looks a little chaotic, but what happens is I have each student own one class period, and they choose some papers that all the other students are going to read. But the other thing I add in is a course wiki site, like Wikipedia, but it's just for our course. The lead student puts up the topic they want to talk about, and every other student takes a riff off that topic by finding a paper or a video or some experience they had and putting it on the course wiki so that by midnight on the night before class, we have the whole course wiki filled up with everyone's contributions that are coming from all over the place. And when we get into class, everyone wants to talk because they own the class now and they have a piece of it. And they're like, yeah, that's just like this article I found, or that's just like this experience I want to talk to you about. For example, in one of my classes, I had a Chinese student, and the lead student was talking about shark conservation. Sharks are being hammered by humans all over the world, and one of the reasons is because they're taken and their fins are cut off and they're thrown back to die in the ocean, and their fins are kept for shark fin soup, which is a delicacy in Asia. That's about what I could say if I gave a talk about shark fin soup and shark conservation. This student from China contributed to the wiki his wedding menu and the wedding menu of his friends, and he showed us the kanji and said, look, my wedding menu is the only one that didn't have shark fin soup on it. And let me tell you what hell it was for my bride and I not to have shark fin soup at our wedding. And those students got such a richer sense of why this is a global conservation problem than if I just lectured to them about it. That's an example of how this kind of decentralized approach becomes much more responsive to the skills that you have in the room. So what I say is that wherever the future is risky and unpredictable is a place where we can learn from nature about how to be adaptable. I have lots of ideas on this in the book, Learning from the Octopus, and in my website, adaptablesolutions.org. Like I mentioned at the beginning, this is a conversation that continues well after these lectures, and many of the ideas I have in Learning from the Octopus came from discussions I had with participants in past lectures I gave. So it's an ongoing, adaptable conversation, and I'm happy to talk to you about it tonight or anytime in the future. Thank you. And I am told that if you want to ask a question, you can go to the microphones. Please tell us who you are and what you do or what gets you excited about the world, and ask away. I don't think we have a traveling microphone. I think you have to go to the microphone.
Good evening, sir. You want to define myself? I'm a businessman. I have two questions for you.
Yes.
Number one, you mentioned the first statement of your lecture is Ecology of Fear, or Ecology of Adaptation. This adaptation, and you mentioned two examples. Example number one, you mentioned Bin Laden and his bird, and the second one, the adaptability of soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. But you don't mention two things. These adaptation forced the other side, and don't mention it about the Iraqi death. And you should, in the south of the border, we should know that they have to adapt themselves to the situation when you go in. I wonder if you explained what constitutes this fear.
Thank you. So the question was about the perspective I took, which was of the US forces in Iraq when I was talking about there. Every story about adaptation has not just two sides, but multiple sides. And when you're telling the story, you inevitably pick a side. You pick the side of the snail that's growing its shell thicker to adapt to the crab, but that's making life harder for the crab to cut into the snail and get a meal. The interconnection of all things in an ecosystem, whether a natural ecosystem or an ecosystem of people interacting, is inseparable. So you necessarily make a shortcut when you pick a perspective and talk about it from there. But we do talk in the book, for example, about the adaptation of insurgents fighting against US forces. And unfortunately, it's a rather grim story, but it turns out that because so many more insurgents were killed than coalition forces, that they actually had stronger, what we call selection pressure, and so they became more adaptable through time. And you see that through time, coalition forces got no better at their job, if you will, of killing or capturing insurgents throughout the conflict because of that continual force of adaptation. And that's what I talked about towards the end, is that we would like to be more adaptable, but we don't want to be under that relentless and horrible tooth and claw pressure of natural selection that we see when there's starvation in the world, that we see when there's war fighting in the world. We want to figure out how to capture the best aspects of adaptability without having to go through that crush of natural selection. And so that's why I talk about issuing this kind of challenge-based way of solving problems. That's one way to jumpstart adaptability and create artificial selection rather than natural selection, which is unfortunately very brutal.
My name is Necla Şörgi, and I'm a professor of human security and peace building at the John B. Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego, and attending a conference workshop being held here at CIGI with other colleagues, academic colleagues. Really enjoyed your presentation, especially its implications for classroom teaching. I have two very simple questions. The first is, we've been learning a lot from ecology in the field of conflict management and peace building. And we've been picking on this concept of resilience. How does resilience play out in your system? And the second one is going back to the quotation you gave at the beginning of your talk about human beings. We're not only struggling for survival, but we have all the additional problems of ideology and values and things like that. And how do you factor that into this framework?
Okay, thank you. Two excellent questions. So on the question of resilience, I didn't mention the word resilience. It's on a lot of people's lips these days. We talk about resilience, especially after Superstorm Sandy we had in the northeastern United States. Are these communities resilient to change? I like to talk about adaptation. I think resilience is a great concept, but sometimes it falls into the trap of thinking about resilience that allows you to go back to a previous state. And I'm very much of an ecologist who thinks that there aren't what we call stable states in ecology that you want to or should go back to. There's just continual change and how much you adapt to those changes. So I think adaptability kind of is a broader term that allows you to talk about continual change, and it doesn't have any kind of goal. And this is a hard thing sometimes to get across to some audiences, that there's no goal in biology. Survival isn't even really a goal. It's just about solving problems along the way. Again, there's no optimum solution, there's no best solution, and sometimes people who use resilience slip into this idea that we're resilient and so we can go back to what we are. And to me, that's a very brittle resilience. On the North Carolina coast where I used to live, people were resilient in that they could come back with flood insurance and several $1 million and rebuild their houses exactly where they were on these barrier islands. But to me, that's not being adaptable to sea level rise, for example. The second question is about the worded idealisms and all the human things that we bring. And I don't want to suggest that we just forget about those. And in fact, a chapter of the book, I talk about this field of what's called evolutionary psychology. And it's about what we take with us into this modern world that we have lived in for less than 1% of our time on Earth have we humans lived in societies that are anything resembling what we live in now. For 99% of our time on Earth, we lived in small clans of hunter-gatherers who, again, fought day after day to struggle to survive. And there's no reason to believe that in that less than 1% of time that we have shed all the things that we brought into our psychology as humans. And that includes especially this notion of humans as a tribal species who identifies itself through culture. And I talk about in the book how you can trace back this system of identity all the way back billions of years to the earliest bacteria and viruses battling it out. Every single organism on Earth has to have a system of what we call self-non-self recognition. For viruses and bacteria, it's all encoded in the DNA. For a salmon, it's encoded in its sense of smell so that it can go back to its natal stream using this incredible sense of smell, chemical receptors, to get back to its natal stream, which is its, if you will, cultural identifier. It'll kill itself to get back to that natal stream. For humans, we've dumped that sense of smell. We don't have a very strong sense of smell. We've replaced it with culture, which includes things like religion and other identities that have allowed us to have shorthands for those things that bacteria and viruses and salmon do. But it's the same thing. It's identifying self versus non-self. And we identify with a group that is in conflict to another group very quickly. We identify that group very well. You see it at a university. They identify with the team mascot almost immediately upon getting on campus, even though they've come from all different places, because they're supposed to be against another group. That's a trivial example, but it happens in every kind of human society. And one of the things we talk about is, how do you get past these worded idealisms? How do you create partnerships or break through conflict when people are so entrenched in this self-identity? And one of the great things a working group member, Scott Atran, who's an anthropologist, who's interviewed thousands of the most radical Israelis, the most radical Palestinians, the most radical Muslims, and tried to figure out what would make them come to the bargaining table, he found out that it really isn't some material good or something very concrete you can offer someone to say, give up that ideology you have and we'll give you this. That almost always backfires and causes people to pull further back into their identity and be further against you. What he found is that symbolic trade-offs, things that you can offer to a group that they value very much, that actually don't cost you that much to give away, or may not cost you that much to give away, can be incredibly powerful for breaking through those intransigent conflicts. And I'll give you two quick examples. First one, when we wanted to open diplomatic relationships with China, we sent a bunch of ping pong players, the US sent a bunch of ping pong players to China, and they got their asses kicked by the Chinese ping pong players. And guess what? No one in America cared at all. But for the Chinese, it was a huge symbolic victory. That is one of their national sports. But they saw that this superpower that they didn't know that much about wasn't afraid to lose face on this international stage. And so it was a symbolic gesture that didn't solve major problems, it just opened the door to it. And the second more recent example, you may have seen this in the film Invictus. Nelson Mandela, when he came to power in South Africa, was urged by his party members to abolish the Springbok rugby team, which they saw as a vestige of white rule, of apartheid. And he said, no, I realize the symbolic importance of the colors and the name and the team of the Springboks to white South Africans. And it doesn't actually cost us that much, except an opportunity missed for petty revenge to get rid of this team. So we're going to keep it and elevate it. And that was a symbolic gesture to white South Africans that his government wasn't going to be about just annihilating and getting full revenge for what had perpetrated before. So those are two quick examples of how to break through intractable conflicts.
Hi, my name is Tennille, and I'm a writer who lives in the area here, and I've just got a quick question for you. When faced with times of change, some elements of a colony or a society will be more adaptable than others. So how can the more adaptable elements bring the rest of them with them?
Great question. How you don't have equal adaptability among different parts of a group. So how can the real adaptable ones bring the other ones on board? And I think there are probably multiple ways of getting at that problem. And one of the nice treatments of this is Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, because he talks about when a new fad comes in, that the people have different roles in making that new fad or that new idea come out. Some are the early adopters, and they get out in front of it. Some are the ones who have the social networks to spread the idea out very broadly. And what I see when I look at these different challenge-based problem solving is that all these type of people come out of the woodwork almost. Some of them are the ones who jump out and come out with the craziest ideas. And then some of them say, well, you know, I like your kind of crazy idea, and I've got a buddy in Palo Alto who could actually code that for you on a smartphone. So let's put those together and see what happens. So I think the problem is not so much that there are some people that are always going to be stuck. It's that there's some people that haven't been empowered to bring their particular skills to whatever change is happening, because we're so convinced that it's only going to be these people who have a PhD in this, or these people who have 10 years experience in this country who are going to solve the problem, when in fact, almost all of us may have some little part to contribute to the whole of the change.
My name is Charles Duran, and I'm here on a conflict, at a conference on conflict and so on. So we're, as you know, in a position to benefit from this. This sounds very much like what B.F. Skinner used to do in experimental psychology, where he did stimulus-response kinds of relationships. So I'm wondering if you would comment on that. And the second related question is, suppose that one individual in a very complex grouping figures out this adaptation, but how does that adaptation get spread to millions of other units or entities in the whole grouping?
Yeah, I can't address the B.F. Skinner question too much. I've only read, I think, Walden 2, and I don't advocate putting people in boxes. That's a gross mischaracterization of his experimental approach. So I'm going to have to pass on that question. On the other question, how do these ideas spread? I think that is going to be a very interesting question for study now that we're seeing, really within just the last few years, a lot of this very decentralized, flattened adaptability coming out and seeing how these things spread. Why does this guy Psy with this mediocre video get 1 billion hits on YouTube for Gangnam Style? This is a question a lot of people are asking. How do these things spread? And there are a lot of auxiliary questions that come out of it, like, for example, creative types, who tend to be the ones who are first out there putting this stuff out, are very excited now that they're seeing their ideas spread very, very far and wide very quickly, but they're also discovering that it doesn't pay the way it used to be. I heard a musician on the radio whose song, very obscure band, had gotten 3,000 hits on Pandora, and his 3-person band shared a royalty check for 21 cents for those 3,000 hits. So we're really in a new realm where there's a different model of movement between idea generation and how you get rewarded and paid for that. I was just at a marketing seminar, and this addresses a question from a little bit from Taylor, who's on the screen, from Hamilton. I was just at a marketing seminar where I gave a talk about this, and one of the other lecturers was the head of marketing for Viacom, which is the MTV company. And they're talking all about how to market to the millennials, which is this young, huge cohort that's coming up. Apparently, 1/3 of all millennials are convinced that they will become famous. This is the biggest cohort ever in Earth history, and 1/3 of them think they're going to be famous. So when Viacom buys a little soda company from Dr. Pepper, who says, Viacom, if you can figure out how to market these millennials, this obscure little soda company, we'll give you an interest in the company. That's how much we just want you to try it. So when they come up with a viral marketing campaign that says, hey, millennials, we got this awesome new soda, make a video and we'll put it up, and it spreads like wildfire because their motivation is not to get rich, but to get famous. So the question about how to spread these ideas, and what I've seen in every organization that's done a challenge, is figure out what motivates the people in your organization. And it's going to be different for every organization and every type of challenge. You can't just say, okay, all of you go out and do something really cool for me. It's got to be directed at a problem. So when I talk to the American Red Cross, that's an easy organization because everyone, from the volunteer who hands out sandwiches at a relief effort to the CEO, firmly believes in the mission of the American Red Cross. So when you ask them for a challenge, they're ready to go, and they're going to do it. How it spread in the military, as I mentioned, was just young officers who now are much more connected than they might have been, say, in Vietnam. They were saying, hey, I tried this thing. For example, I'm going to tell you a story. I probably shouldn't. I couldn't put it in the book. But a young officer told me, we had a problem going from my first to my second tour. My first tour was totally kinetic, shooting, bang, bang, all that stuff my young Marines loved. The second tour was I had to calm down my young Marines, and we had to go to meetings, lots and lots of meetings about road building, about building infrastructure, all this stuff. So I'd send my soldiers out to these meetings, and the Iraqis would come back to me and say, this isn't going to cut it. We do not want enlisted men at these meetings that are so vital to our future. You need to send us officers. Well, this is a young commander. He's got 2 officers he can work with. What does he do? He dresses up his sergeants like lieutenants and sends them out to the meetings. Did he ask anyone, can I put lieutenant bars on my sergeants? No, he just did it. And when it worked, he communicated by email to his fellow captains all around and said, hey, if you want to impress these Iraqis, just get a bunch of lieutenant bars and dress up your sergeants and make them look nice and send to these meetings. And when that worked, it spread around there. And by the time the higher-ups, the colonels found out about it, they were like, good job, soldier, that worked well. So it spreads differently in different organizations. I want to take a question from Taylor from Hamilton. He says, it seems like your approach has a lot of applicability beyond security. Have you done any work on organizational adaptability for companies that struggle and face issues of stagnation? And in fact, I'm starting to get into that realm. There's a lot of lessons for business in adaptability, and businesses mostly acknowledge, yeah, we need to be more adaptable. One of the things that businesses adamantly fight against, despite evidence to the contrary, is redundancy. They love to get rid of redundancy, and they love to strive for efficiency and optimization. And I had a friend who made a small fortune selling motivational pins to companies that said 110%. It's like nothing in nature would survive if it operated at 110%. Even if it operates at 100%, you've got to operate just enough to get by. So there's this endless push for efficiency and optimization rather than redundancy. But if you look at some of the most successful companies, they use redundancy amazingly well. One example, Southwest Airlines. It has come from having 3 airplanes and virtually being sued out of business in Texas 30 some odd years ago to becoming the #1 air carrier in the United States. Southwest Airlines has one type of aircraft. They have 700 of the exact same aircraft. They use that redundancy. And it's not the most efficient way to do things because it's maybe not the perfect aircraft for every single route, but what they gain in the bigger picture is every pilot knows how to fly every single plane. Every stewardess knows how to serve every single plane. Every baggage handler knows the exact best way to put in bags quickly on this plane. And when a plane breaks down at your gate, and there's a Southwest plane 2 gates down that isn't scheduled to take off for 3 hours, they pull that plane down to your gate, and you're on your way, and you're happy. Whereas Delta Airlines, which has 11 different planes, God forbid if you have the one Airbus at that airport and they've got to get a technician from France to fix that thing, you're screwed. You're not flying out of Atlanta that day. In fact, Southwest is so committed to this redundant operation that they just took over AirTrans and got 117 planes from AirTrans, but they weren't the same type as Southwest planes. And so Southwest said, hey, Delta, we know you like planes. We'll give you a real cheap price on these planes, and guess what? We'll even paint them in Delta colors for you. And it was like a Trojan horse they were giving Delta. They're like, we're going to make you even less responsive because now you're going to have a 13th type of plane. So despite the fact that there are really good examples out there of really innovative companies using this adaptability stuff, a lot of companies still maintain the idea that short-term efficiency is the way to go. Redundancy is not efficient at all, but it gives you many long-term advantages. Another advantage for Southwest, they have Boeing aircraft's undivided attention. There are Southwest employees in the Boeing factory when a new version of the 737 comes out. And Southwest is saying, no, move that door here, move that service aisle here, do all this. And Boeing listens because Southwest is their #1 customer. And they only built that up. They didn't have that when they had 3 Boeing aircraft. But now that they have 700, they have Boeing's ear.
Animal risk mitigate, all these animals mitigate risk. Why the human being at the present time don't adopt that risk, in your opinion, or any factor for this adaptation of risk? Thank you.
So you're asking why haven't humans adapted?
The human being, yeah, similar to animals.
Yeah, and so the question is why haven't human beings adapted like other organisms have? And what I say is, again, for 99% of our time on Earth, and for over 1 billion people right now today who are literally struggling to survive, there is still that intense selection to adapt. But many of us, and again I say thankfully, through medicine, through technology, indeed through our own adaptation, have insulated ourselves from the daily need to be adaptable. And it's these crises, like Hurricane Katrina or 9/11, that suddenly wake us up and be like, oh, wait a second, we've been kind of asleep. We've been just kind of on cruise control. And so the idea is, how do we get ahead of those crises by setting up systems that are more inherently adaptable than the systems we tend to go for, the syllabus-driven classroom, the bureaucracy-driven emergency response organization. How do we continue to have that adaptability? And that's what I'm trying to challenge people and organizations to do.
David Welch, Balsley School. That was a great lecture, by the way. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. So thanks. So one narrow technical question, which is how on earth does a ground squirrel know how to respond differently to different predators? And one bigger question about decentralized sensing and the signal-to-noise problem. How does nature solve the signal-to-noise problem? And one of the things the 9/11 Commission showed was there was plenty of information in the system, widely distributed well before 9/11, but it wasn't integrated, and it didn't find its way where it had to go.
Yeah.
How
Okay.
does nature solve that?
Two great questions. The ground squirrel question, totally baffling and mystifying to me. How many iterations of communication with other organisms did it take for today's modern ground squirrel to figure out all these different ways to talk to its predators? It's an incredibly baffling story, and that's why that paper excited me so much when I read it just a couple years ago. And you see it all the time with all kinds of organisms. Cuttlefish communicate to other cuttlefish in secret polarized pulses of light. I saw a video of an octopus that swims down a coral reef, and straight down the middle of its body is a dividing line. One side is all these crazy tie-dyed psychedelic colors. The other side is perfectly dull. And the biologist who was diving with this octopus said, that side is where the female is, that side's where the male is. To the female, he's saying, check me out. To the male, he's saying, nothing's going on here, buddy. How you doing? Wow. Nature is amazing. So, to the second question, which was, remind me, I got so excited about the octopus.
Signal-to-noise ratio. How does nature
Signal-to-noise ratio. So the signal-to-noise ratio, what is just idle chatter out there and what is a clear signal? And there's this great story in the book. And here's a story some people at first get surprised I tell, because it's about the imperfection of nature. My friend Dan Blumstein, a professor of behavioral ecology at UCLA, who we all call Marmot Dan, because he loves marmots. Probably most of you know what marmots are. Big, medium-sized alpine mammals that live in groups. And Dan studies everything about marmots. And he does all sorts of weird experiments with them. He sends in a little remote-control truck with a badger pelt over it that he calls Robo-Badger. And he looks at what happens in the marmot community when Robo-Badger comes into town and how different individual marmots, who all have their individual personalities, respond. And what Dan finds is that there are marmots which he calls cool-hand Lukes, or cool-hand Lucies. And these are the marmots who, they also alarm call, like the ground squirrels. They only make an alarm call when there is a clear and present danger. There is a real signal of danger, and they're very careful about only making that alarm call, which the alarm call both alerts the predator, but it also alerts the other marmots. Oh, there might be a predator here. We've got to stop eating or having sex, which are the two things that marmots do, long enough to see if this predator is a threat. But there are other marmots that Dan calls nervous Nellies. And the nervous Nellies make alarm calls all the time. A twig breaks, and the nervous Nellie is alarm calling. And the predator comes, and she's alarm calling. And the wind blows, and she's alarm calling. Now, you would think it would be like the little boy who cried wolf. And the other marmots would be like, oh, it's just nervous Nellie. But the fact is, sometimes nervous Nellie's right. So every time nervous Nellie calls, all the other marmots have to pay attention. And we did a lot of nervous Nellie type signaling after 9/11 for years. We had this U.S. Department of Homeland Security, this color-coded warning system in airports. It's finally been taken down. And for 5 years without cease, every day that warning system was at level orange, the second highest level, which I think was extreme risk of terrorist activity. Every single day was this alarm call. And many of us tuned it out. Many of us had no idea what to think. The only thing I knew is if I walked into the airport one day and it was down at code level green, I would have really freaked out. Because after 5 years at orange, why would it suddenly go down to safe? So we didn't learn a lot of lessons about good signaling in the years following 9/11, and I still don't think we have a good sense of that. One way you avoid the signal-to-noise problem, and I talk a lot about tsunami detectors and smoke alarms. In Banda Aceh, one of the hardest hit places by the Boxing Day tsunami, very shortly after the international community poured in all this aid and built these tsunami warning systems, local people dismantled those tsunami alarms because they gave out so many false alarms. And in fact, in North America, millions and millions of homes have dismantled or let their batteries go dead on their smoke detectors, even though we know it's a good idea because every time you cook sausage in the kitchen, you set off the smoke detector and it drives you nuts. Organisms in nature get through this signal-to-noise problem, again, through redundancy. They sample and resample, not just at the time a signal is coming in, but all the time throughout their lives. By sensing the world, understanding the complexity of the world and its patterns, they can sense when there's a change in those patterns. They're constantly resampling. It's not just saying, here's the signal my programmer told me to go beeping at. When I hear it, I'm going to go beep at it, even if it's a mimicking signal. They resample to make sure it's not just noise. And that's a lesson we can learn in making more advanced warning signals, but it's also a lesson we have to learn by realizing what damage we've done to ourselves by pushing away that process of observing nature and encouraging our children to get out into the world and look at nature and be a naturalist, which used to be one of the biggest pastimes, was being a natural historian, but it's fallen out of favor, and we spend so much time as adults and as children now in front of screens where everything is binary, we don't have that same keen ability to understand problems and patterns and changes in those patterns in the world. And so that's kind of my closing manifesto is we've got to get back out into nature and realize not just what it can do for us in this abstract way that I've been talking about, but in a very real sense of understanding the complexity in the world. There's no more complex place than the biological world, so it's a great place to start. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Dr. Sagarin, for the exceptional, I would say, exciting presentation tonight. I very much enjoyed it. I know that I'll have a different framework for analysis next time I'm watching, well, whether it's Planet Earth documentaries on the Nature Channel or the news on CNN, I'll be looking at it differently. And I think greater minds than mine will have to figure out what the lessons are for international affairs, including possibly some of the experts we have at CIGI this week on global security issues. A very esteemed audience, and I'm glad they were able to see this presentation. I realize it would be too literal to say, you know, if we're negotiating with the Taliban that we should shake our bushy tail. But I guess even I understand that in solving the world's challenges today, there are approaches to problem solving that we can find in unconventional places and maybe even obvious places like the nature all around us and within us. So thank you very much again for that. Just before we leave, a few quick notes. I want to thank everyone in the audience, both here and online, for attending. The video from the live webcast will be posted to CIGI's website in our online video archive. Our next few events in the CIGI auditorium will take place on Wednesday, February 27th. At 7 p.m., Thomas Edsel will present The Changing U.S. Electorate, America, and the World. Thomas is a professor of journalism at Columbia University following a 25-year career with the Washington Post. On Thursday, March 7th at 7 p.m., Robert Rotberg, who's here tonight, a visiting Fulbright scholar at CIGI and at the Balsley School of International Affairs, will deliver a CIGI Signature Lecture. He is a renowned Africa expert with expertise in failed states, corruption, good governance, and civil and interstate conflict. And on Monday, March 25th At 7 p.m., award-winning journalist and vice chair of the UN's Global Commission on HIV and Law, Shireen El-Feki, who is from Waterloo originally, will take an innovative look at shifting sexual attitudes and behavior in the Arab world at a lecture entitled Sex and the Citadel. So be sure to register for our events newsletter to find out about our upcoming signature lectures. And finally, one more thank you to our sponsors, Wordsworth Books and 570 News. Thank you for coming. Be sure to pick up a copy of Rafe's book out in the lobby, and a safe journey home. Thank you.